What was it exactly that first interested you in diving into some of these heirloom varieties?
My interest in heirloom beans started in 2015 on a trip to Oregon. I saw orchid beans at a farm market and around beans my whole life. Black and navy beans don't look like orchid beans, and they really caught my attention.
Kevin Messing, I am really looking forward to chatting today and diving into what it's like, what life on the farm is like, what it's like to grow a wide variety of different types of beans. Time flies, and I think it's been several years since we first connected, but I remember seeing a photo of your flor de mayo beans. I have a bag sitting with
Oh,
me
well,
right now. And I saw them and I was like, wow, these are spectacular. So we connected about that. And at this point, I've gotten to try many of the other types of beans you grow as well. And I can attest to the fact they really are great. But I'm going to stop
thank
babbling
you.
on and, well, you deserve it. I'm going to stop babbling on and ask you, would you do a bit of a self introduction about yourself, Sheridan Acres? We'd love to hear.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad to be here and talking with you today. My name is Kevin Messing, and I run Sheridan Acres in Ubly, Michigan. That's in what we call the Thumb region of Michigan, about 2 hours straight north of Detroit. And so this farm I run with my wife Sarah and our two beautiful daughters. And while we both work off the farm, the opportunity we have to farm with both my parents and my sister and brother-in-law is really a passion of ours. And I'm really lucky to farm in the heart of Michigan bean country.
It's a beautiful place to live, to grow beans. Your daughters are absolutely adorable too.
Thank you.
Michigan is known for, well, several types of beans, but black beans is definitely one of the top one Michigan is known for. And I know you grow black beans, but you also grow quite the variety of heirloom beans too. So do you want to share what types of beans you're growing on your farm?
Yeah, so like you said, we grow about 160 acres of dry beans in total on our 600-acre farm. Um, Most of those are black beans that we sell to a larger shipper, but I grow about 10 acres of heirloom beans, more or less, every year. Heirloom and less common market classes of beans, I'll say.
We should probably clarify before we go much further. Do you want to define what heirloom beans means to you?
Yeah, so for Sheridan Acres, I blanket everything as heirloom beans, but in reality, I grow a little bit of everything. So I have black and navy beans and your more common commercial classes of beans, but there's some that are I call them less common beans. So cranberry, cannellini, mayacoba, yellow beans, uh, and then also heirlooms as well. And heirloom is a bit of a loosely defined term. It's kind of like natural. There's not any set definition of it. But when I think of heirloom for beans, I would say they're beans that haven't had advanced breeding done with them, or beans that have a story. And that story may be um, how they've traveled across the world, maybe a certain group or group of people moved them and they migrated across the world, or that story may just be one of regional importance as well. For example, the flor de junio beans, a favorite in central Mexico, or even the rojo chiquitos that I grow are a Central American style small red, which is very different and unlike the small red beans that we see in most of the United States. So maybe not heirloom specifically, but a special bean to certain regions of the world.
You mentioned some of them. I said one of the first of your beans I saw was the flor de mayo, and I
Hmm.
calypso is another one of the
Yes.
ones I love. Are there a couple other types that you want to mention to people that maybe they won't have heard of before that you grow?
Oh, there's so many of them. And I'm lucky that there's other bigger heirloom bean companies around that have raised some awareness of them. But I would say buckskins are one of my absolute favorites. Everybody has their favorite type of bean they love. There's large seeded beans. I really love the smaller seeded creamy beans. They cook up just a certain way, and I really really love those. So something like the rojo chiquitos or the buckskins are some of our favorites in our house.
Good answer. And you grow a lot. You said,
Yes.
there are a ton of varieties out there. How do you
Hmm.
end up choosing which ones you decide to grow?
Yeah, so I'll grow on any given year 10 to 15 different beans on that 10 acres. So it takes a lot of effort in planning. And I would say it's a lot of experimentation. There are some groups that do some research. University of Vermont does heirloom bean trials every year or most years, and I've relied on some of that information, but a lot of scouring the internet, looking for advice anywhere I can find it, and a lot of trialing on the farm. And sometimes it doesn't matter as much research as I may do to confirm or verify that a bean is a certain bush habit of growth. Um, Growing season to growing season, they vary as well because some of these beans haven't had that advanced breeding. They've been kept seed for hundreds of years. So certain weather conditions can make beans grow or react differently to that environment. Some years are more successful than others just because of that fact as well. So a lot of experimentation on the farm. Um, we farm in a more humid climate, so vining beans don't work well for us. So I'm trying to find bush style beans that work in our environment without any special inputs or extra steps to grow them.
Got it. So the beans they're keeping you on your toes, so
Yes,
to speak.
they sure do. And even weather related to heirloom beans, they don't have that nice upright growth that we see with our commercial beans. So adverse weather at harvest time can is even more of a challenge with the heirloom beans too. So they definitely keep me on my toes.
So it sounds like, there are some challenges, and I want to ask you about those in a minute. But before we do, kind of circling back, what was it exactly that first interested you in diving into some of these heirloom varieties?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in beans. To be honest, some of my earliest memories on the farm growing up, sitting on my grandpa's laps during the combine as we were combining navy beans as a kid. And even more, I mean, the first crop I ever grew on the farm myself 10 years ago were black beans. So I've always loved growing beans. I've been a bean grower at heart, but my interest in heirloom beans started in 2015 on a trip to Oregon. I saw orchid beans at a farm market and around beans my whole life. Black and navy beans don't look like orchid beans, and they really caught my attention. So that really started a quest of internet searches, and that next year I planted my first heirloom bean trial of 5 or 6 different varieties or kinds of beans on half an acre. Um, I didn't know what I was going to do with them or where I'd go, but that's what started it all. Just seeing heirloom beans for the first time.
I love it. And so the rest
Yeah.
is history. Here you are
Yes.
moving forward. But I
Yes.
imagine logistically there are probably some challenges to growing that many different types of beans, especially that many types of heirlooms on, 10 acres or so, like you said. So what do some of those logistic challenges look like?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones is trying to gauge volumes. Like any food company, what is the demand going to be? Beans can store for a very long time, but to hit that peak freshness, within a year or two is really ideal. And direct marketing, I wanted to hit that within a year. So trying to guess volumes and what my customers would want was one of the biggest challenges that I had. Trying to gauge that conditions that can have a bad negative impact on our commercial beans are magnified in heirloom beans. Some some crop environmental conditions that don't affect our black beans cause issues in my heirloom beans. I have some root rots become problems, and beans look good, but they're actually a little hollow, and so they're beans that would float when you put them in a pot, and that's a bit of a negative. And then harvest is slower. I spend more time cleaning my combine out in between varieties than I actually do combining most times. I have a
Oh
machine
no.
that's easy to clean, but it still takes time. And sorting different beans out from each other is a bit futile. It takes a lot of time and effort. And just because I grow such a wide variety on a small acreage, the capacity to get them processed and cleaned like a commercial bean processor would, it's not really viable because those small volumes would not I wouldn't be able to run them through a commercial plant just because of that smaller volume and the variety in them too. Color sorters don't work on beans that are 2 or 3 different colors. Um, so yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. There's a number of them along the way, but I guess I love to grow beans, and so I haven't given up on it yet.
Nice, embracing the challenge. And for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the process, so you're going through your combining and then you're going to have to clean out the combine to make sure you don't get a happy marriage of all these different types of beans. And how long about does it take to clean out a combine, make sure it's good to go before starting on the next type?
Yeah, so I harvest mine with an older pull type. It's a Lilliston bean combine, so it's an old converted peanut machine from Georgia. But they had their heyday here in Michigan in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s before we switched to direct harvest. So luckily, I was able to acquire a few of them at a reasonable price. But it's about 20 minutes in between each variety to clean out, to empty the hopper of the seed I've harvested, and then clean all the spots in between, close it back up, and be ready to go back out there.
Yeah, and with it being very important to do things in a timely fashion when they're ready and before other weather rolls in, that is time is important. Time is of the
It
essence.
it
So,
is, and it because I'm not direct harvesting, we're doing a two-step harvest, which is very has become uncommon in Michigan. Some of the organic growers are still doing a two-step harvest process. But yeah, I can't harvest all my beans in a day. I have to plan ahead. And thankfully, not all the beans mature at the same time. But there are times when the weather's right, I have to make a decision if I'm going to give up maybe a little higher quality sample in order to get these beans harvested. So when I have my next window, I'm able to get finished up. So it does take some planning and scheduling. And I know the beans that ripen earlier, so I plant those closer together. So I have lanes in my field to get back in when I can harvest the rest of them. It does definitely take some planning and scheduling to make that all happen.
absolutely, your knowledge as you go is really coming into play here. And do you also maybe want to clarify, just in case people aren't familiar, what direct and two-step harvest means,
Yeah,
what the difference is between those two?
absolutely. Yeah, so direct harvest is more what you would see in a commercial soybean operation where your typical combine with a header on it, we were able to come in and direct harvest those beans. And it's not quite as simple as that because dry beans are still dry beans and they are more gentle and more prone to issues around harvest. So if the beans get too dry, they'll actually split in the combine, and that creates pick or loss for the growers because those aren't saleable products, those split beans. And still, wet conditions at harvest, pods can shell. There's still loss in that crop. So it's not quite as simple as harvesting a soybean, but it looks more similar to that with upright direct harvest. My two-step process, I have a piece of equipment called a picket. One step where it cuts the beans off at the ground and then windrows them. And normally we do that when there's a dew on so we don't break pods and lose beans. And if the weather's right, I can let them lay for a couple days to continue to dry if that's right. But there are times where I will windrow them in the morning or the evening before and then combine them the next day or the same day, depending on what that window looks like and how mature that crop is. And that two-step harvest is really more common in other areas of the country out west where it's more arid and they have that time to let the beans lay in the field without the fear of rain. That works well. Michigan, we have that humidity and we get rain in the fall, so we don't always have that luxury of letting beans lay to dry naturally in the field.
Right. I know we talked about that, I think around last harvest season, and I was saying, in Colorado where I'm based or Nebraska, some people will, they'll leave the beans maybe for a week or so and kind of in those windrows, let them dry, and then they'll come through. So it's a very different process. It's interesting to see those differences
It
throughout the
is.
country
It
or throughout
is.
the world.
Mm-hmm. But that two-step process works really well for my heirloom beans because they're not bred to be upright, so they're wide, bushy, low-growing plants. And I with the wide variety of beans I grow, it works really well to capture as many of those as I can. It's it's a process that works for me very well.
And so as you're growing all these beans, I'm sure you're getting some benefits for the farm, right? So what are some potential benefits that growers might experience from growing beans?
Yeah, so beans are a legume, which means that they actually can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, which is a huge benefit. So beans do require some fertilizer, but because they can fix that nitrogen into the soil, they can provide some of their own. So Beans often require a few less inputs as far as fertilizer goes, and dry beans actually can survive on an incredibly low amount of rainfall and still produce a crop. I believe it's about 8 inches of rain during the growing season. Um, Luckily for us in Michigan, we are all rain fed, so we're not irrigating, but in other areas of the country where they're producing beans, that is a really big benefit compared to other crops like corn or small grains and other crops that require much more water. Um, the thing I love about beans for our farm is that it really fits our total farm system. So we also grow corn and wheat, and so growing beans allows us to break up that work window quite a bit. So corn is our other spring planted crop. Beans are planted much later than corn. They're also harvested a lot earlier before it. So we don't have everything happening at once on the farm. And the beans allow us, because they're harvested earlier, to seed our wheat crop at an opportune time. So they beans in general work really well with that system because we can, there's times we'll harvest beans one day and within a day or two we're planting wheat and in a week you've got something green growing on that field already in the fall. So we have that ground cover. So we're keeping our soil in place that wheat can take up any nutrients that may have been left by the beans, some of that nitrogen they're fixing that wheat can take advantage of. So it's in general, they work so well in the system that we farm in, and they fit very nicely in their place.
It's amazing how many benefits they do have. Like you said, it's, lower water footprint, really great in rotation with other crops. And it sounds like on the side of working through things too, being able to kind of stagger those planting and harvest times. So lots of benefits. But I also want to acknowledge that there are challenges. And you talked about some of these already, but what are some potential challenges to growing beans? And the reason I want to really bring this up is so that when folks go to the grocery store and they pick up some beans, or when they order beans from you, they think, oh, wow, a lot went into this. So if you want to maybe share some of those, again, challenges that might come along with growing
Yeah,
beans.
absolutely. And on the commercial side, direct harvest has made things easier and faster, but we're still subject to that adverse weather, and I saw that last year. Beans are very much more sensitive to rain, large amounts of rain especially. So saturated soils, beans really struggle. So yield loss can happen there. Very hot weather during flowering is detrimental to beans too. They don't fill pods as well. Pods fall off in that weather. So they're much more sensitive to adverse weather. Even though they are more drought tolerant and can survive on less water, extreme weather still impacts them. Um, Harvest can be a real challenge. 5 years ago in one of the bean growing regions, they got so wet, I think it was like 30% of their crop got left in the field. It just got too wet to harvest beans. Um, so still, like anything, they are subject to that. Um, and like I mentioned with the heirloom beans, they haven't had that advanced breeding. So my harvest tools are much different. It takes more effort in planning and timing to get those heirlooms harvested. And then just at my size, it's time consuming to clean out in between and trying to decide when to harvest. It is definitely a challenge there.
Yeah, so a lot of consideration and love is going into getting these beans.
Yes, yes. Beans are not an easy crop to grow, but they're an enjoyable crop to grow. I will say that. They're not easy, but I really enjoy them.
That's good to hear. We're glad that you grow beans. And kind of on the note, whether it's challenges or benefits or just in general, is there anything else you want to add that maybe somebody who isn't on the farm that they might want to know or that you'd like them to know about growing beans?
At my scale, the equipment to clean beans is quite hard to come by. 50 and 100 years ago, thinking back to what that farm economy looked like, there were a lot more smaller processors. So your flour mills, your family-owned elevators, everything was done at a smaller scale. And so that equipment for a farm to clean their own beans was really easy to come by. But now as we've consolidated, our market has become more efficient. All those processors are a lot bigger. And so the last 5 years for me, it's been a bit of a treasure hunt to track down some of this equipment to actually clean my beans and use that similar equipment to what a commercial processor would use. It's been fun. I've collected a lot of, mid 19th or 20th century equipment. I'm working on one that was They tell me it was built in 1947, trying to fully restore a density separator to clean my beans. Beans coming out of the field are one of the amazing crops that are nearly ready to eat. You can cook them. Aside from fresh produce, beans are one of the few crops we grow. But they do take some special equipment to get them ready for sale because it can be a bit dirty and dusty at times in harvest. So, yeah, I guess I'd add that it takes a lot of care to grow them, but they are one of those few crops that you can eat almost directly out of the field.
I mean, it's amazing watching your journey. So I'd encourage people to follow along, like on your Instagram or Sheridan Acres. I've really enjoyed seeing some of this equipment because you'll say, okay, here it is. Now I need to kind of fix it or, update it. And then you share that process, which is really interesting. And you package your own beans too. So I know you already shared a bit about that, but in terms of when you're actually trying to get it into the bags and everything, you want to dive a little bit into kind of how that part of the beans journey goes.
Yeah, so like I said, we do clean our own, and my goal, aside from trying to get beans to my customers within a year or two of harvest, is to deliver the cleanest product I can. If you can just rinse those beans and start cooking with them, that's my goal. Because beans are harvested in a natural state, so every now and then it's a dirty, dusty thing. There's little bits of pod, dirt, stones sometimes make it in with the beans, and so that equipment to clean them, as I said, is hard to come by at my scale. I'm getting there, but they require a lot of love and care in the form of hand picking to get the ugly beans out, get the stones, the dirt, and make sure that they are clean for my customers. So yeah, it takes a lot of love and effort to do it. It takes time, but at the end of the day, when somebody can get those beans and they just light up when they see them, and it's an easy rinse to add them to the recipe, that's my goal. So it does take a few extra steps to get them there.
Well, I mean, it really shows. Earlier this week, I was cooking your calypso beans, which are one of my favorites. It's hard to pick a favorite, so I'll just say one of my favorites. And I was, getting them all ready. And my husband asked, and we eat a lot of beans in this house, as you may imagine. He's like, how are they so clean? So you really do a great job. Like these are pretty much ready to go. So it sounds like you even go through hand picking. A lot of love goes into this, but we appreciate it.
Thank
So
you.
thank you.
Yeah. A fanning mill, your basic grain cleaner, can get you pretty close with a good quality crop. But some of those defects I mentioned, those hollow beans, the ones that don't quite form all the way, it takes a density separation and some specialized equipment to get them there. And so, yeah, without that, it takes more hand time and effort to get them there. But I'm hoping with some equipment set up here in the next year I should be able to deliver a lot higher quality product consistently, especially in those challenging growing seasons where the quality of the crop isn't quite there.
Okay. Well, for what it's worth, I've never had any problem with your beans. I think that the quality is already quite spectacular, but
Yeah,
I'll keep following along and seeing what new equipment is coming down the
sure.
line. And you mentioned you like to see consumers, light up when they get a hold of your beans, really enjoy, or customers, wow, these are great. Do you have any stories of, dishes or reactions from customers when they get your beans and cook with them that you want to
Oh,
tell us about?
yeah. So I started marketing my beans directly to restaurants. Being smaller scale, farmers markets came to mind, but with a young family and the time working a day job and farming, spending weekends at farmers markets was a little daunting. So I wanted to target restaurants to try and get my name out there. And what I didn't realize is it's a very tight knit community in some of the higher end farm to table restaurants. And so word spread. But it's so much fun. I had some friends, they were making soy free tempeh and miso out of my beans. Really cool to see. And the best part of that was they found out that split beans held that tempeh cake together better. So a product that was normally getting discarded, I was able to save for them, and they could make a great product out of it and turn a waste stream really into a whole new item. That was really fun to see. But the relationships with the chefs has been amazing. I've seen beans cooked and served with rabbit, octopus, duck, you name it, in soups, stews, and even, I mean, really my favorite is just a bowl of broth and beans. Um, and that's, you would be surprised. One restaurant we sit at, just the number of bowls of beans coming out of the kitchen consistently all day.
That's fantastic. Love seeing all that innovation and coming back to that, seriously, just a simple, here's a bowl of delicious beans with fantastic bean broth. I mean, there's not much to improve upon that, right?
Yeah.
It's great to begin with. And you work with a lot of chefs too, or you see your chefs using your beans. And for those of for people who may not know, cool beans is not just a phrase, it's also a cookbook. And I would argue one of the most famous bean cookbooks, at least in the United States. You got to meet the chef and cookbook author who wrote this. Do you want to share a bit about what that experience was like?
Oh yeah, it was such an awesome experience to meet Joe Yonan. It was at for a dinner at Grainer Farm in Southwest Michigan. I was a little starstruck sitting next to him on a panel, but he's such a genuine person, and he really does love beans. You can tell in the cookbook, but he's such a nice guy to get to sit and get to know and talk to through the night. And he grew up in West Texas eating beans a bit out of the affordability of them, and but he said he always loved them. And talking to him, it was funny because his journey to writing that book really started about the time I was starting my journey growing heirloom beans. We didn't really know that, but just through talking, we learned that it was kind of a similar timing for us. And Chef Abra Barons, she prepared a lot of his recipes from the book using our beans that were really harvested just weeks prior. So it was really a once in a lifetime experience. It was so much fun. It was so much fun to sit with next to Joe and just talk beans.
Quite the
So
experience, and how interesting that your timelines sort of aligned and you got to
yeah.
meet there. And any particular dish that are remembering or I wish I could eat again that came out of that night
Oh,
using your beans?
I can't remember what it was. I'd have to look at the menu, but it was like a sweet corn puree with beans. It was really so good. There were so many good dishes, but that one really stood out. The way it was shaved or pureed sweet corn, it was so good with the beans. And everything was cooked so well. All of them were great, really, to be honest. So Bean Nouveau at Grainer Farm it's worth the price of admission.
Well, it sounds like it because you're making me hungry. So, there you
Yeah.
go. But one thing we actually did before this interview is we kind of opened it up to see if people wanted to submit questions. One was just, what's the best part of being a bean farmer?
If I'm going to be honest, it's having the ample supply of beans ready to cook whenever I need them. But I I love the idea of growing a product that ends up in somebody's kitchen without having to get milled into flour or processed into something else. It's beans are beans, and so the product I grow is what gets delivered. I mean, they're the beans that I plant for seed next year often too. The same beans you're eating are the beans I'm growing. So that is that makes beans one of the most fun crops to grow.
I love that. That's a great answer. And we are obviously bean enthusiasts. I know
Hmm.
there are other people out there like us, but have you been seeing any noticeable changes or maybe an increase in interest in beans? What are some trends you've been
Yeah,
noticing?
interest is definitely up. Continually growing. I wish I could always grow the number of beans I needed to supply to everybody that wants them. That's being heirloom beans. They don't always perform in the field. So especially this year, a big struggle, maybe 25% of a crop for compared to what I was planning for. So, but demand is up. Every year I have restaurants reaching out, individual consumers. That is increasing. And one restaurant, Mabel Gray in Detroit, they do several vegan weeks or months per year, and they're not trying to imitate non-vegan food. They're doing creative dishes, and that is an ever popular week and event. It sells out far in advance whenever they announce it. So that's the amount of beans they use in those weeks is incredible, and they do a really good job with it. And I think the popularity of that shows.
Yeah, you don't need to try to mimic a more
Mhm.
traditional meat dish or anything. These
Yeah.
beans, they shine by themselves. So
Yes.
that's great that they're showcasing that.
Yeah. They're showcasing the ingredients, not what they're trying to become or imitate. So that's
Yeah.
really the cool part of that.
That's wonderful. And I wasn't give you a moment in case we missed anything. I am going to ask you about your favorite bean dishes because
Sure.
we can't not talk about that.
Yeah.
But before I do, is there anything else that you want to add that comes to mind that, oh, I want to mention that? And you don't have to.
I,
You've already shared a
yeah.
ton of your
No,
expertise.
I would say, and this is more on cooking and eating beans, just don't be afraid to experiment. Start with black beans from the grocery store and just get comfortable and then branch out. Black beans are really affordable. Navy beans, pinto beans, they don't cost a lot. So just experiment cooking with them if you're not comfortable cooking beans from dry. You know, I I rely on my Instant Pot tremendously. My life would be so different without it. And I know it's not always the favored way to cook beans, but I've done it so many times over the last 5 years. I've really learned the intricacies of how that my individual Instant Pot works. And now it's to the point it's a breeze. I throw them in with my seasonings and I walk away. And, an hour later, I have beans.
You have the bean system down. That's an
I,
important system to
I
master.
really do. It is. And I have to thank Dr. Henry Thompson for that. He spoke in Michigan to a group of bean growers and challenged everyone to eat a cup of beans. I think it was in 2019. And I took him serious. And I'm happy to say I'm still on the train.
Well, I think your daughters are. I believe your wife
Yes.
and daughters are too. So it's a family experience.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. We eat about a pound of dry beans cooked every 4 or 5 days, always.
I I love that.
Yeah,
So you're raising them to enjoy a really, really beneficial food and a food that also has meaning for your family too.
yeah, yeah,
So when it comes to favorite bean dishes, it's too hard to pick one. I won't force you to
yeah,
pick your number one
yeah,
favorite, but what's maybe one of your go-to favorite dishes when you're going to
yeah.
be cooking some of your delicious beans?
So one we'd like to share. This ends up going to potlucks and family gatherings. It's a black bean dip from Once Upon a Chef. My wife made this for me years ago when we first started dating. Coincidentally, it was the first year that I ever grew a black bean crop. And during harvest, I handed her a pound of just black beans right out of the field, and she had no idea what to do with them. But she found this recipe, and it was so good, and everybody loved it. So it's really become a staple for us, and it is kind of special because of that. My wife didn't grow up in this area, so eating beans and growing beans wasn't familiar for her. So that one is kind of has a special place for us. The other one is just our beans and broth or fridge beans, like we call them. And like I said, we cook them about every 5 days, and we just throw in an onion, some garlic, salt, thyme, and olive oil, bay leaf, and we cook them and keep them in the fridge, and they're always there. And we add them to everything. They're good. They're so good on their own. Even with like a grilled cheese, they make a great soup. But they're also you can add them to anything. The flavor isn't so strong that they overpower. So we have add beans to everything.
Why not?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, they can go in anything. So, fridge beans,
Yep.
love that name, and
Yes.
also love that played a role in your love story.
Yeah.
That makes them extra special.
Yeah.
So,
No, it was funny. I hand shelled some beans, and my wife looked at me, and I told her I liked a bean dip, and one time that my mom had made, and so she found this recipe, and it's really become a staple for us.
that's really beautiful, actually. Maybe somebody comes to you and they're saying, all right, I'm convinced I want to start enjoying more beans because I know it's going to benefit food systems, it's going to benefit my health, it's going to benefit the health of the environment. There are so many different culinary options, though. Where should I start? Is there one recipe you might recommend or one approach that you would say, okay, here's a good starting point if you want to start eating more
Yeah,
beans?
kind of like I mentioned, adding a few beans to just about anything works. A taco, a casserole, or anything with the sauce, pasta sauce. I sneak a few beans in when we make spaghetti. We make simmer sauces. That sweet potato and beans go really well in a simmer sauce over rice. That's we kind of try to include them everywhere. And like Dr. Thompson mentioned, bean smoothies are a favorite of mine. He said navy beans. I like black beans in my smoothies. I get a half cup of beans every morning in a smoothie, and you'd never tell. They're there, and they really bring a lot to it. And I know I'm halfway to my bean goal every day as soon as I finish breakfast.
Starting the day strong with beans for breakfast is a great plan. So, good advice.
Thanks.
Thank you for those tips.
Yeah, absolutely.
And on that note, if people want to find out more about what you're doing at Sheridan Acres, where can they find more information?
Yeah, you can find us. Our website is simply sheridanacres.com. We are on Facebook as well, but I'm most active on Instagram, and that's just at Sheridan Acres. That's where I'll share updates on the farm for the year, or if restaurants tag me in a dish they're making or any other bean things. That's where most of that comes across. So I'm most active on Instagram, but we're on Facebook, and our website as well is where you can find our full lineup of beans and a little bit about us and the history of the farm.
Yeah, there's great information on your website. And like I mentioned earlier, and like you just shared too, you really share some wonderful glimpses into what's happening through your Instagram. So
Yeah,
following
thank
along, I
you.
think, is a great idea.
Thank you. I'm not as good at it as I could be, but I do my best to share a few updates now and then.
Well, you have a few things going on, considering you have a family, you also work off the farm, and you do this, and I'm sure other
Sure,
things. So I
sure.
think I think it's you're doing fantastic.
Thanks.
But Kevin, thank you so much for making time to
Yeah,
chat. I hope to continue the conversation. I will
yeah.
continue bothering you about beans for sure, and
Any
I'm looking
questions?
forward to
Send them
seeing
to me.
appreciate that. Looking forward to seeing what happens this season. And I actually do have a little bit more of your calypso beans in the fridge. I had some of my oatmeal this morning.
All
I'll be
right.
having some for lunch.
That
So thank
sounds
you.
great.